Thanks for tuning in to Asymmetrical Haircuts. To help us keep doing this show, please look at our support us page on the website where you can find our Patreon and our newsletter.
Yeah, that's where we discuss our War Criminals book club. We do reviews, and just for the price of a cup of coffee, you can support us.
When someone comes from outside with a specific task of looking at sexual and gender-based crimes, that's what I have on my plate. That's my task. And I didn't run the risk of being diverted to other tasks. And that is the importance of having someone who is dedicated to looking at this specific type of crimes.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we made a commitment to dip into gender and justice during last year, and we're still pursuing that regularly.
Yeah, this time we're looking back at the case against Malian Islamist Al-Hassan at the ICC.
Oh, yes, this is an opportunity for a Stephopedia if ever I saw one.
So his official name that I always like to say is Al-Hassan Abdul Aziz Mohammed Mahmoud, and he was transferred to the ICC in 2018. The ICC said he was a member of the Islamist group Ansar Din, who took over Timbuktu in 2012 and 2013, and that he was the de facto head of the Islamic police there. He was charged with crimes against humanity, kind of running the gamut: torture, rape, sexual slavery, persecution, forced marriages, and war crimes, much of the same thing. And then they added also passing sentences without judgment pronounced by regular court, essentially.
So can I ask you to skip to the judgment? I think he was convicted in June last year.
He did. He was convicted of crimes against humanity, torture, persecution, and other inhumane acts. But he was acquitted of the war crimes of rape and sexual slavery and attacking protected objects, and also of the charges of forced marriage. And the persecution was decided that it wasn't on the basis of gender, as the prosecution had wanted, but persecution was done on the basis of religion. The judges said in a kind of convoluted judgment where we all were kind of left going, huh? What did they just decide? Finally, this is now final because there were no appeals, and both the prosecution and the defense left it. Victims' representatives tried to protest to enlarge the crimes, but they were overruled. We have some links to summaries of the criticism that we'll all put in the show notes because there was a lot of comment about this.
I was thinking it might be interesting today to look back at how we got these gender persecution charges. I mean, it's one of the first times that the ICC has ever actually put that on the agenda, even though in the end they weren't finally accepted by the majority of judges. But by looking back at how the investigation was conducted, we thought that might provide some insights into maybe current prosecutions and maybe some future potential prosecutions. So joining us to help give us that insight is Marta Valiñas, who's been on the pod before. Hello, Marta.
Hi, Janet. So nice to be with you and Steph today again.
Marta has been on the pod before, as Janet said, and then at that time we talked about her work for the UN fact-finding mission in Venezuela. But she was also part of the team of the ICC Office of the Prosecutor when they were investigating Mali and specifically Al-Hassan.
So, Marta, what role did you play in the investigating team at the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court? I mean, maybe you can tell us what it was like to be part of the team. You could paint the picture for us. How was it that you kind of got the idea to analyze the details that you have and come up with this particular crime?
Right. So I was initially deployed to the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC in November 2014 as an SGBV expert, specifically to assist the Mali investigation team Initially, my task was to review the information available and make proposals for the investigation of SGBV in that situation. So at that time, when I joined the team, practically the whole team, the rest of the team was working on the Al-Mahdi case. As you know, Al-Mahdi was convicted in September 2016 for intentionally directing attacks against religious and historic buildings in Timbuktu. So that was the first case in the Mali situation, and everybody was working on that. And here I come with the specific task of looking into what is out there on SGBV and what can we do, what steps should we take to start investigating those crimes as well.
Let me just jump in to clarify the acronym, because maybe not everybody is as into it as we are, but sexual and gender-based violence. So that's what we're talking about when we're using that acronym.
In fact, at the court, we usually use the acronym of SGBC, so sexual and gender-based crimes, because of course we're dealing with crimes at the ICC. So that's what I was looking at specifically. And I was the focal point in the investigation team for sexual and gender-based crimes. Now, as I was telling you, in the initial phase, I was reviewing all the information, proposing an investigation plan for the sexual and gender-based crimes part of the investigation, and then also establishing relations with intermediaries. And then once the investigation progressed and we started doing interviews with victims and other witnesses, I did those as well, of course, together with my other fellow investigators.
So I assume it's a relatively small team. I mean, just a few analysts and a few investigators, and then you've already got an amount of evidence, but you're suggesting to them to get more evidence in order to be able to really understand the contours of any crimes which might have a gender or a sexual element.
That's right. So we were around 7 investigators in total in the team, 4 women and 3 men, plus the investigation team leader. And we had between 2 and 3 analysts, depending on the time. Of course, I'm talking about the investigation team. Then we have the prosecution team. And my role indeed was at that initial stage to be working mostly actually together with the investigation team leader and saying, look, I think we need to speak with this type of persons. We need to collect this type of documents. We need to be looking at even in other interviews that we are conducting about other crimes, also be asking about this and that and formulating the questions in this or that way. So that's what I was doing. I was suggesting how to go about finding the sources of information, but also how to then conduct those interviews, which then, as I said, I conducted, but also other colleagues conducted. And then I was also very much in touch with the prosecution team once we started getting that information in, drawing their attention to interesting information that we were receiving and coming to the point of suggesting to them certain charges like gender-based persecution.
When you came, they specifically, I guess, cast around for somebody who was specialized in this, but you have a part of the work already done. Did it surprise you? Were there things that really stood out that hadn't been looked at or that were really overlooked in this sexual and gender-based violence area? Or more of a situation of where you could kind of put the finishing touches on something that they roughly already started because you had more expertise?
No, the investigation on sexual and gender-based crimes had not really started. So that's why, and partly because of what I told you, the initial focus of the investigation in this situation was what then became the Al-Mahdi case. So it was on one particular crime of directing attacks against religious and historic buildings. And then once the investigation also opened up to other crimes, and that's at the time when I also was there and looking among those other crimes, I was looking specifically at sexual and gender-based crimes. And what I think is interesting is when someone comes from outside, as I did, with a specific task of looking at sexual and gender-based crimes, that's what I have on my plate. That's my task. And I didn't run the risk of being diverted to other tasks. And that is the importance of having not only gender expertise, which we can speak a bit more of what that brings, but of having someone who is dedicated to looking at this specific type of crimes.
When you were looking at the material that had been gathered, or you were looking at the, what you could understand as the situation on the ground, what was it that led you to say, okay, I think that we could really find out more information about sexual and gender-based crimes? Was it, were there some specific incidents that you could point to? I'm thinking about things like forced marriage. I mean, what was it that kind of pushed you in that direction?
This case covers crimes committed between April 2012 to January 2013 in Timbuktu, so northern part of Mali, which is in West Africa. And what happened there was that in the first months of 2012, Timbuktu was taken over by two rebel armed groups made up of a mix of Malians and foreigners. And these groups were called Ansar Din and the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, for short, AQIM. So during this period of time, these groups controlled Timbuktu and exercised their power over the local population. And they wanted on the one hand territorial control over this region, including for financial reasons, but they also wanted to impose their worldview, in particular their version of Islamic religion and of Sharia, which, as you know, is Islamic law, upon the local population. Now, the majority of the local population in Timbuktu is Muslim, but these groups thought that several of their practices, their traditional practices, were against the version of Islam that these groups adopted and wanted to impose. So what did they do? They arrived to Timbuktu, they took control, and they imposed new rules of behavior upon the local population, such as prohibition of drinking alcohol, prohibition of listening to non-religious music. Well, they destroyed the religious buildings that the local population had built in honor and to worship individuals that they saw as saints. And then, for example, they forbade extramarital relations. So all of this were new rules of behavior that were unknown to that local population. And they applied sanctions for violations of this behavior through several institutions that they created, namely an Islamic police, the Hezbollah, which was a morality police, and the Islamic court. In relation to women and girls specifically, what was happening? Part of these new rules of behavior were applied specifically to women and girls, and they were in line with the group's gender ideology, meaning their conception of what roles these women and girls should have in society, right? And again, these were rules that were not familiar to the women and girls of Timbuktu. So these rules included a dress code according to which women had to be fully covered, their bodies and their heads. They were not supposed to leave their houses unless accompanied by a male relative, and also not after a certain time of the day. They shouldn't be seen talking with men that were not their relatives. And so what happened was that in order to impose and enforce these rules, these groups were subjecting women to constant surveillance in the streets, in hospitals, in the market, so in public places, but also even in their houses, going into their houses to see if they were fully covered. And when they were not abiding by these rules, women were subjected to, they were harassed, they were threatened, they were followed in the streets, and they were sometimes beaten with sticks in the street as punishment, and in certain cases they were detained and imprisoned in a very small cell without proper conditions of detention. Now, some of those cases, we got to know all of this, right? What was happening in terms of this constant harassment. Now, some of these women who were detained started telling us through the interviews that they were raped by the members of the armed groups that were controlling that detention facility. So that's on the one hand, all that was happening around the imposition of the rules and the sanctions. On the other hand, another interesting thing that was happening was that the members of the armed groups were encouraged by their leadership to enter into marriages with the local women. And they were given monetary assistance for that. And members of the armed groups, including Al-Hassan, served as intermediaries for these marriages. It's what in the judgment they are called jihadi marriages, right? And then these marriages are with local women and men, members of the armed groups that were foreigners, right? So they didn't have their families there, they didn't have their wives, and they were entering into these marriages. Now, these marriages served at least two purposes. On the one hand, they served to consolidate the presence and dominance of the armed groups in Timbuktu and their sort of integration, let's call it that way, into the local population, because they had plans to stay for a long time, right? And on the other hand, they provided, and that's what's interesting, an appearance of legality under Sharia, under their version of Sharia, to what essentially constituted rape and sexual slavery. Because these women, by being legally married under their version of Sharia, even if we would be talking about temporary marriages of a few hours or a few days, this meant that sexual relations, even without the consent of the wife, would be considered legal under this version of Sharia. So indeed, this was a way for these foreigners to have sexual relations with local women under the veil of legality and legitimacy. So all of this were the facts on the ground and that we were hearing about that pointed out to, of course, the commission of different sexual and gender-based crimes and gender-based persecution.
How then do you kind of narrow that down to say that this is gender persecution? What elements in that sense does it need? Because there are also people who will say there were also men who were being beaten because they were smoking or drinking or listening to the wrong music. So it's not necessarily persecution based on gender, it's persecution based on religious grounds, which is what one of the argument of one of the judges. So I'm being kind of the devil's advocate, but where would you tease out this particular gender element?
Right. So I do think it requires putting on a gender lens in order to be able to start seeing this information from the ground and seeing that there is a possible gender-based persecution charge. It requires being open and being also equipped to make the link between individual crimes, that could be of rape or then sexual slavery, making the link between those individual crimes and the gender ideology of those who are committing those crimes. In other words, what do those crimes have to do with the gender norms that these individuals that belong to the armed groups that are committing these crimes, what are the gender norms that they act upon and that they want to impose? Meaning, what are their assumptions, their expectations about the role of women and girls in society, and therefore also their prohibitions of what women can and cannot do. So it has to do with looking at what does this detention have to do with the roles that the members of the armed groups that are detaining the women believe that they can and cannot do. And so when that ideology or gender norms provide the motivation for the commission of a crime, or when they are the reason for the selection of victims, so women and girls in this case, selection of victims according to their gender, and also the manner in which a certain crime is committed, that is when you must work with gender-based persecution as one of the crimes that is part of your investigation plan and your case hypothesis. So I'll give you a very concrete example from this case. We knew from very early on, this was known to everybody, that women had been imprisoned in Timbuktu, and men had been imprisoned. Now, together with my colleague, an analyst, who had all the information in her big table about all the cases of imprisonment that we knew about, we started seeing clearly that women were being detained for different reasons than men were being detained. Men were being detained for, because they stole something or other crimes that were regular crimes under Malian law, but also for drinking alcohol, for not wearing amulets, things that were now prohibited by these groups. Whereas women who had been detained, in almost the totality of the cases, had been detained because they did not respect the dress code. So the imprisonment of women was related to a new norm that applied specifically to women on how they should dress. There was also a dress code for men But not only was it not enforced nearly with the same rigor, in fact, it wasn't enforced because we had several information, we had photos and statements. They were almost never enforcing that dress code for men, and no men had been detained for disrespecting that dress code. So it was specifically applied to women in that way, with those sort of sanctions. They were also, announcing this new dress code as part of the new rules that were being imposed, how people should behave, in different sermons, for example, at the mosques and when they were speaking with the local population. Now, the imposition of a dress code does not amount to a Rome Statute crime, right? But the sanctions applied for not respecting this norm based on gender norms and prohibitions, the sanctions did include acts, the beatings and the imprisonment in inappropriate conditions that do constitute Rome Statute crimes. And as the majority in the judgment pointed out rightly, the way that this rule was being enforced, as I told you, women were being harassed, were being followed in the streets, were being beaten with sticks and then detained, actually had an impact on these women's real ability to continue living their lives normally and doing their normal activities outside the house, going to the market, working, for fear of being punished and for fear of being arrested. And then, of course, some of these women who were being detained were then subjected to sexual violence. So you see how the imposition of a norm that could seem harmless to some in terms of crimes we're talking about, the dress code, which in itself derives from the group's gender ideology, is imposed also in a specific manner to women and girls, in a manner that is very different than the equivalent norm was being applied to men, and how it not only affects women in their daily lives greatly, but also how the sanctions applied gradually lead to acts that constitute Rome Statute crimes, including non-sexual crimes, so the detention, but also sexual crimes, the rapes in detention. And the other interesting point it relates to the forced marriages. If you look at, they were marrying local women. Was there consent or no consent? You can get to an understanding that these constitute forced marriages because of the coercive environment that they were taking place in, through statements where women say that indeed they were not consented marriages. But if you don't link these marriages to the ideology and norms of the armed group regarding sexual and marital relations, you will fail to understand that at least part of the motivation for such practices had to do with the group's conception of what should marital relations be like, and the fact that sexual relations under the veil of legality of a marriage are allowed according to their version of Sharia and therefore are legitimate. You need to link the individual acts to the gender ideology, the gender norms, the prohibitions, the assumptions, and that's when you understand that all of these acts together do constitute persecution on gender grounds, in this case against the women and girls of Timbuktu.
I'm really enjoying the way that you're laying out the building blocks that you put together. You've already mentioned briefly the judgment, and we mentioned it up top, so we will get to that. But I'm just wondering, from a practical perspective, the ICC had never charged gender persecution before. It had never had a gender persecution. It does now. It had a sexual and gender-based crimes focal point. So were you going out on a limb to say, okay, let's go for gender persecution? Did you have to push for that?
Well, it was an interesting timing for me to arrive to the court for this investigation to start, because the investigation and actually the prosecution of this case of Al-Hassan were done under the previous chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, who, as you know, had prioritized sexual and gender-based crimes under tenure. And in the 2014 policy that she adopted on sexual and gender-based crimes, it was clear that the investigation and prosecution of these crimes was a priority for her office. I joined in 2014, the same year the policy was adopted. Then, as we progressed in the investigation, in 2017, Patricia Sellers was appointed gender advisor to the prosecutor. Now, all of this happened before the gender-based policy was adopted. This was later, and the gender-based prosecution advisor was appointed. This was later as well. But I credit the success of this investigation and the inclusion of the charge of gender-based persecution on the following. First, as I was telling you, having one person in the team dedicated specifically to sexual and gender-based crimes, I think is important. It's someone that is looking into it, that has the space to do it, and that takes the lead in proposing ways of looking at the facts that you have before you. It's important to have a receptive leadership that allows that hypothesis to enter the investigation plan, and also receptive leadership in the prosecution team, of course, for the same reason. It's important that you have teamwork between that person in the investigation team specifically assigned to look at these issues from the investigative side and colleagues in the prosecution team that understand and are open to explore gender-based charges. It was important to have the gender advisor, Patricia Sellers, who supported our proposal. And it was important to have the policy as an unequivocal guide in the office saying, we need to look more into these crimes. We need to do better at prosecuting these crimes. And so it provided the framework for the prioritization of the investigation of these crimes. So there was a favorable momentum. But yes, it's still breaking ground, right? And it's still facing challenges, facing questions, facing resistance. Oh, but men were also imprisoned. Oh, but there was also a dress code for men. Oh, but why is this gender-based persecution and not only religious-based persecution? But all of these factors that I just listed, I think, allowed us to have the first case reaching trial stage with a gender-based persecution. And, I spoke about the success of this investigation and prosecution because we can speak more of the judgment, but, in spite of the final outcome, there were very important findings supporting that gender-based persecution was committed in Mali.
Yeah, let's kind of fast forward or let's skip to the judgment. It was really delayed, and since it came, there was a lot of back and forth with the judge being ill, and it was delayed for months and months. And then when it came out, there was a lot of criticism that it was relatively incoherent, is the quote I have here. We have a couple of critiques that we'll link to in the show notes. We had Leila Sadat, who said that it lacked legal clarity and it approached the charges of sexual and gender-based violence without understanding the context in which such violence occurred. And she also said that the opinions taken together were fractured and confused. And there were comments from another friend of the pod, Valerie Oosterveld, who did an article with Rosemary Gray, who also criticized the outcome and said that it continued certain past approaches in international criminal justice in which gendered violence was routinely erased from the narrative of conflict and genocide. And she said some of the opinions were rooted in outdated assumptions and there were inaccurate conclusions taken. What I remember from having that judgment read out is that they spent an inordinate amount of time detailing the horrors that were visited on the women of Timbuktu by the Islamic police and the morality police. And they really went out of their way to say, oh, these crimes happened, and then kind of went, but we don't think this is gender persecution. We just think that this was because it was religious. And I remember looking at everybody else in the press room kind of going, is it gender persecution or not? What did they actually rule? Because he said it was women and girls were being persecuted, I think is a line in the summary of the judgment. But the gender persecution wasn't actually named. So it took a while for it to trickle down that how they structured it. It was very odd. You were not already left the court. Yeah. You had already left the court when this trickled down. What was your reaction? Do you then Did you sit down to see the verdict, and what was your reaction to it?
Oh, I definitely sat down. I was waiting very impatiently to know what was going to be the judgment. And what happened to you and to me, and I think to other people who took an interest in the case, was that, we're listening to Judge Mindwa read the summary of the judgment. And I was just in absolute shock and utterly puzzled with where things were going when he reached the final stage of the summary, as you said. And even when then I was reading the judgment, I felt that, I was watching quite a good movie, meaning a lot of the positive findings by the majority in relation to not only, the rape and sexual slavery and the imprisonment, but also gender-based persecution. The majority did find that it did happen and that it was attributable to Al-Hassan. So it felt like you were watching quite a very good movie. And then at the end, there was one of these crazy plot twists that completely changes the course of the movie and leaves you feeling disappointed, bewildered, puzzled. I was just in absolute shock. And it was difficult as a lawyer to understand it, to explain to other lawyers. Imagine explaining this to non-lawyers. Try to explain to someone who was not involved in the case or didn't read the whole judgment. Actually, 2 of the 3 judges thought that all the sexual and gender-based crimes, well, not all actually, but most of the sexual and gender-based crimes occurred, as argued by the prosecution, that they were part of the common purpose of the armed groups, that they could be attributed to the accused under the mode of liability that was proposed by the prosecution. But then he was found not guilty. How do you explain this? Because one of the 2 judges decided that the accused should not be held criminally responsible for any of the crimes that were part of the case due to duress and mistake of law, which was a rather controversial decision. So you feel like you end up with a terrible mathematical result where you first have 2 against 1, and then at the very end you have 2 others, against the one being Judge Prost, which was very consistent throughout. But Judge Prost and Judge Mindwa had the majority in the judgment in relation to these crimes, had very positive findings, not only about, the fact that the crimes took place, they found the witnesses to be credible, but they said very interesting things about gender-based persecution. And I think that's why this judgment will serve for other cases, both at the ICC, but also at other national jurisdictions. So, those 2 judges said that the groups had specifically targeted local women and girls by reason of their gender, depriving them of some of their fundamental rights. And they said because of the particular roles, expectations, and conduct that these groups were assigning to women and girls because of their gender. And they said clearly these acts were part of a discriminatory campaign against women and girls, and that the members of these groups knew that these acts, these discriminatory acts against women and girls, contributed to their projects of imposing their vision and interpretation of Sharia on the local population, including on women and girls. So, in other words, they said clearly that these acts were committed against women and girls of Timbuktu because of their gender. And this was also the case with the forced marriages, by the way. Of course, Judge Akane dissented on all of this, but Judge Prost and Judge Mindwa did agree that the forced marriages were part also of this purpose, this plan of the group to impose their vision of Sharia, which included all these gender norms. So they even said that these members expected their wives to stay at home and saw these marriages with the local women as a means for the members of the groups to have sexual intercourse in a permissible manner, during which women had no right to refuse to have sexual relations with their husbands.
You're on a podcast, so I want to tell our listeners that when she said permissible and I don't remember husband, she did the little making quotation marks to make sure that she doesn't actually believe that this was permissible or they were actually legally married in any way that was acceptable.
Right, and actually that's how it is in the judgment. It's written with in inverted commas, which is really good. It really denotes an understanding by Judge Minwa and Judge Prost about what was the motivation, what was the ideology behind them. And so in that sense, that's why I was telling you, it was like watching a good movie while reading the judgment. But then you get to the end, and because Judge Minwa decided something that wasn't related specifically to the gender-based crimes in question here, but that he thought that the accused acted under duress and mistake of law. That's why he ended up not being found guilty. Otherwise, he would have been found guilty because they both thought that these acts could be attributed to him. There was disagreement on the rapes in detention because of the time when they took place and whether it could be established whether Halassan had knowledge of the intention of the members of the group to commit that specific crime of rape in detention. But I think Judge Prost had really good arguments in her dissenting opinion on that as well. Very much a gender-sensitive way of looking at those acts as well. So the judgment and dissenting, or partly, the separate, partly dissenting opinions of Judge Prost and the judgment, as I said, have very positive findings on these crimes.
We have so many more questions that we know that we could put to you, Marta, but we're going to wrap here at the moment and kind of reserve the right to bring you back when we look at gender persecution again. But we always ask some asymmetrical haircuts questions just at the end of the pod. And the first is there a particular court case, probably not the Al Hassan one, but maybe some other court case that you refer to regularly, maybe when you're doing some teaching or you have in the back of your mind while you're doing your work? Is there a court case you'd like to share with the audience?
I'm very involved with domestic jurisdictions, and it's incredible the type of jurisprudence that we're getting from those. So I feel quite inspired by jurisprudence, even from Argentina, from Guatemala, with all the challenges. And we're speaking about places where gender-sensitive approaches to justice you'd think are maybe lagging behind than the ICC. That's not the case. So, for example, one of the cases that I think is really, it would be good for ICC judges to also read it, is the Molina Tyson case in Guatemala, also a rape in detention, and where mid and high level accused were found guilty. People that seemed to be untouchable, but they were found guilty. And because the judges found that these individuals created and contributed to creating a system of repression that allowed this type of acts to occur in what would be the Rome Statute language in the ordinary course of the events. So I think it is quite inspiring. It's also inspiring because of the history around this judgment, the persistence from the victim and her family, and the partnership that they established with the prosecutor in that case, leading to a very successful decision.
Our other traditional asymmetrical haircuts question, and we were already talking about watching a really good movie that turned out to be really bad at the end with a weird plot twist. But we always ask, is there any movie, book, podcast, something that you recommend for our listeners? It could be something linked to the work that you do, or it could be what you do to get away from it, or it could be both.
So I absolutely recommend this documentary called They Would Have to Kill Us First. It's about Mali. It's about this period of history in Mali. It's focused on the prohibition of music that these groups were imposing. You probably know this. Mali is a country of wonderful music. The desert blues, traditional music that is just beautiful and so rich. And one of the things that these groups were trying to do was to prohibit that. Imagine that. How can that even be possible? And so this documentary is about the acts of resistance to what these groups try to do. And it's a beautifully made documentary, really inspiring, very informative also of what happened in Mali, but it's just great. And, I love it. I love when art allows us to learn more about all these terrible things that happen, but in a way that, in this case, through music, just brings beauty into the way that the story is being told.
So we just want to say thank you, Marta, so much. We know that you've been very busy. We've been trying to put this podcast together for a long time, but we managed to track you down and pin you down to get you to do it. So thank you very much for spending the time with us today to explain a bit more about what it's like trying to actually investigate this kind of crime.
Oh, thank you both for your patience and flexibility, and for taking up this issue and the Mali situation, because, the fact that there were no appeals at the end leave quite a bitter taste for not only people who worked on the case, but I think mostly for the victims, the population of Mali, the women and girls who suffered all these acts, and those that were brave enough to face security threats and come to the court and testify. And so the lack of appeal, I think, is rather frustrating for all of these women and girls, because justice in this sense was not done for them. But I do hope that more of the positive parts of this judgment are taken up and are mentioned, because, as I said, it does state that these acts happened against women and girls because of their gender.
Thank you very much for highlighting that again and picking up again the appeals, but also these positive aspects. And it at least shows us that this is a topic we'll keep talking about, and a judgment that will probably be reviewed and looked at for a long time when looking at these gender persecution charges. So thank you very much for taking the time, as we said before.
Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.